Thank you, Ciara. I'd like to commend Deputy Doherty for introducing this bill to the floor of the House this morning. The bill seeks to amend the Land and Conveyancing Act, which was passed last year. Now, Part 1 of the Land and Conveyancing Act reverses the Dunn judgment. This was the judgment that meant that no bank could take possession of any house. Now, it is regrettable that that judgment needed to be reversed, but the harsh reality is if banks weren't able to take possession of a property on which money was secured, then there would be no future mortgage market in this country, or it would be treated as unsecured lending, in which case mortgages would be 10, 12, 13% interest. So unfortunately, Part 1 is a necessary evil. However, it needs to be balanced with an obligation on behalf of the state and of the banks as to how and when possession is taken. Part 2 of last year's Land and Conveyancing Act is essentially a version of the Family Home Protection Bill, which I introduced in 2011. Now, this section allows a judge, for the first time in the history of the state, when he or she has an appeal for possession before them from a bank, to consider a wide range of new criteria never before considered. The judge may adjourn proceedings of its own motion if it considers appropriate to do so. They may adjourn proceedings to consult with a personal insolvency practitioner. They may instruct the personal insolvency practitioner to make a proposal. They may consider whether the mortgager, in other words the bank, has participated in any process relating to mortgage arrears. They may consider whether the mortgager, in other words the bank, the borrower has made any payments to the bank. And critically, they may consider the conduct of all parties before them in the court. Now, the Master of the High Court, Edmund Honohan, described this as a significant change, and it's certainly a piece of legislation that I developed with Ross McGuire SC, which I'm very happy came into law. Now, Deputy Doherty's bill adds several criteria to the Land and Conveyancing Act. It allows a judge to adjourn for 6 months rather than the current 3. It allows the judge to insist that parties engage in an insolvency process. It allows the judge to insist that the Code of Conduct in mortgage arrears has been adhered to. And it allows the judge, critically, to refuse to grant permission unless the bank or the vulture fund or the God knows who's been sold the mortgage in between has exhausted every reasonable option other than possession before possession is granted. It allows the judge to insist that the residual debt is dealt with as part of the possession order. And it allows the judge to direct that evicted families are given sufficient time to find a new home. Now, I would say, Minister, that in the context of what is going on in this country, every single one of those proposals is a fair and reasonable change to the Land and Conveyancing Bill. The government has set targets for the banks. The government has said, you've got to offer all of these, make all of these offers of sustainable restructures by certain dates, or we'll penalise you financially. Now, at the time, I and others said that these targets were not only misplaced, but they were going to be very damaging, and they were only one part of the solution. The government has focused on the quantity of offers made, but it has done nothing about the quality of those offers, and it has done nothing about the consistency, or rather the complete lack of consistency of those offers, not only between banks, but within individual banks. So what's the reality? What's the reality of a government insisting that banks hit targets on quantity, targets they can define themselves, because of course, let's remember, the banks are allowed to define, not the government, the banks define what is deemed a sustainable offer. So what's happened? Well, we had really shocking testimony this week. The 4 banks that appeared before us, by their estimates, believe there will be about 6,500 evictions just based on the mortgages that were under consideration thus far. It doesn't include any of the other unsustainable mortgages, which they still have to look at. It doesn't look at any of the mortgages which are unsustainable but still managing to stay out of arrears. And it doesn't consider any of the institutions beyond the 4 banks that we saw. And as we know, there's a lot of other banks, there's a lot of other funds in this country, and now we've another 2 coming in from America who are debt specialists. What else did we see? What's the reality? We now know that the banks are vetoing the insolvency service proposals. The insolvency legislation had promise, but it was neutered by giving the banks a veto. There have been about 50 protective certificates issued to date in the context of 175,000 mortgages in arrears. 50. Richie Boucher told us yesterday, the Chief Executive of Bank of Ireland told us yesterday, that they will veto any proposal that involves any write-down of secured debt. He's one of 2 chief executives who told us that. So let's look at the offers that have been made. 4 out of every 10 of these so-called offers are actually legal proceedings. Another 10% are so-called assisted voluntary sales. Now let's remember, some of these assisted voluntary sales may be exactly that. I'll tell you what a lot of the other ones are. A lot of the other ones are the bank coming and saying, you have 2 options. You can either agree to leave the house and we'll sell it, or we can evict you and we'll charge you an additional 10 grand for our legal fees. So let's not forget, this so-called assisted voluntary sale is not always that. So 40% legal, 10% assisted voluntary sale. So that's half of the so-called offers made so far. About another 35% of the offers made so far actually increase the total payments that borrowers will make to banks over the lifetime of the loan. So things like interest only, things like term extension, things like recapitalization of arrears. All of these propose to solve unsustainable debt by increasing the debt. About 15%, about 3 in every 20 offers made to date by the banks we saw this week involve reducing the payment burden on the family. So that's the reality of not insisting on quality. That's the reality of a government which has said, we'll set you targets, but you know best. You go off and deal with all of your borrowers on a case-by-case basis, and sure, what could possibly go wrong with allowing a bunch of banks in Ireland determine what should happen in a mortgage market? We have complete inconsistency. Bank of Ireland deserves special mention. The legal proceeding numbers that it brought before the committee this week were twice as high as some of the other banks, and 4 times as high as permanent TSB. Their split mortgage, of course, we know is a joke. What they do is they break your mortgage in half and they charge you the same interest rate on both halves. Of course, one part of it goes down as you pay the capital down, but the other half goes up because you're not paying the capital on that. And they came before us with a straight face yesterday and said that splitting your mortgage in half and charging you the same interest rate on both pieces actually addresses an unsustainable mortgage. And the reason, Minister, the reason those 4 men could come before us and look us in the face and tell us that is because this government lets them. You're letting them. You're letting them come in and laugh at all of us. And I can assure you, after the last 4 days in committee, that is exactly what they are doing. It's what they did 6 months ago. It's what they did 12 months ago. That is not to say, I want to say in fairness to some of the banks and in fairness to some of the people working in the banks, there are some real efforts being made. It certainly is not a curse on all of their houses. But Bank of Ireland came in yesterday and they said, well, we'll write down unsecured debt. So I asked them, well, what about the debt, the residual debt in a sale? So you evict a family, they owe you 300,000, you sell their house for 200,000. The remaining 100,000, by definition, is unsecured debt. You, as Bank of Ireland, must account for that as unsecured debt on your books. So you'll write that down, right? Wrong. They say, well, that used to be attached to a security, so we'll continue to call that a security. And basically what they said is, if we want, we will follow people to the grave for that money. So you get evicted by Bank of Ireland, you owe them 100 grand, but that 100 grand is tipping up at 5% a year. So it'll cost you €5,000 a year just to keep your debt to Bank of Ireland at 100 grand. What else do we know? We know the mortgages are being sold to vultures. We know they're being sold to vulture funds. We know that the vulture funds appear to be allowed pick and choose. Now, the special liquidator told me and told the media that Lone Star and Oaktree were not being allowed to pick any performing mortgages. So we asked for confirmation in writing. Turns out, when we forced them to write it down, they changed their story. Turns out, The written confirmation I have from them is that Lone Star and Oaktree did buy all the non-performing loans and some performing loans. Now, the anecdotal evidence we have from mortgage holders is those who have performing loans that are in equity have been taken by Lone Star and Oaktree. And those who have performing loans in negative equity are going to NAMA. Now, we have US-based debt specialists who may be choosing performing loans that have equity on loans that are variable rate. Not single variable rate, it means loan by loan, family by family. They can ratchet up the interest rate to what they want. And if and when the family says, we simply have no more money to give you, that's not a problem because there's equity in the house. They can just evict them. And of course, they're completely unregulated. Now, what the minister has said is, if he thinks that these vulture funds aren't obeying the CCMA, well, then he'll introduce legislation. What an extraordinary position to take. Imagine saying, well, it is illegal to burgle all of these houses. But these houses here, it is okay to burgle them. It is legal to burgle them. However, if we find a lot of burglars burgling them, well, then we'll make it illegal. That's what he's doing. What an absolute preposterous position to take. Now, let's talk about the scale for a second. There's 175,000 mortgages in arrear. Let's assume that there's about that many again. We don't know. There's no figures. But let's assume there's about that many again who are in pre-arrears, who are doing everything they can to stay out of that 175,000. Now, that's about 1 million people. 1 million men, women, and children are affected directly by this. It doesn't include their parents who are helping them. It doesn't include their siblings who are helping them. It doesn't include the places they go to work, where inevitably they can't bring their very best to their job because they're worried about whether or not they're going to have a home when they leave work. Minister, the mortgage crisis has been going on for 6 years. We are the only country on earth to have allowed this happen at this scale for so long. No other country has so spectacularly cocked up its mortgage crisis. And yet it goes on. Why? Because of government inaction, because of a government in thrall to the banks, and because of a government in thrall to the markets. So what do we need? I'll finish on this. We need a strategy to deal with the tens of thousands of men, women, and children who are going to be kicked out of their houses, according to the bank's own figures. We need legislation that mandates solutions. We need legislation that says to borrowers, if there are 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 solutions out there, we're going to mandate them. So whether or not you get kicked out of your house, whether or not you're going to have money to invest in your future, whether or not you're going to have money to invest in your children's future, doesn't come down to whether or not it is Bank of Ireland or AIB or Oaktree or Permanent TSB or Pepper or Apollo or Danske knocking on your door. Equal and fair treatment under law. And finally, you should accept this bill. This is an excellent bill. It goes right to the heart of the current imbalance in the inconsistency and the power imbalance between citizens in distress and the banks who they bailed out. I would finish by commending Deputy Doherty for bringing forward an excellent, timely, thoughtful and targeted piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Donnelly.